Ed Gein, a name that has etched itself into the annals of true crime infamy, was not just another killer in America's dark criminal history. Known as the Butcher of Plainfield, Gein's macabre deeds would go on to inspire some of the most haunting works in popular culture, including Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs. To fully grasp the depravity of Ed Gein, one must delve deeply into his twisted psychology, his upbringing, and the horrors that unfolded in his small farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. From the outset, Gein's life was steeped in dysfunction and isolation. His father, George, was an alcoholic who failed to hold down a steady job, while his mother, Augusta, was a religious zealot with a tyrannical grip on the family. Augusta viewed the world as inherently sinful, especially women, whom she considered harbingers of immorality and corruption. Under Augusta's iron rule, Ed and his older brother Henry were forbidden from socializing with peers or forming relationships outside the family. Augusta frequently read passages from the Bible emphasizing sin, punishment, and damnation. The Gein children were raised in an environment of fear, repression, and fervent religiosity. Ed, particularly, became deeply attached to his mother, idolizing her while internalizing her worldview. This dependence set the stage for the chilling events that would later unfold. In 1940, George Gein died of heart failure brought on by his chronic alcoholism. With their domineering father gone, the brothers began to work odd jobs to support the household. Ed was known as a reliable and somewhat peculiar handyman. Though shy and soft-spoken, he was well-liked in the small community of Plainfield. The turning point in Ed's life came in 1944. While burning brush on the family property, Henry Gein mysteriously died. Although his death was officially ruled asphyxiation due to smoke inhalation, there were suspicious bruises on his head. Some speculate Ed may have been involved, but no charges were ever brought against him. Then in 1945, Augusta suffered a series of strokes and died, leaving Ed alone in the isolated farmhouse. Her death devastated him. The one person who had controlled and defined his existence was gone, and the fragile tether that had kept his dark impulses in check snapped. After Augusta's death, Ed began to retreat further into himself. He sealed off large portions of the farmhouse, preserving his mother's rooms as shrines. The rest of the house fell into squalor, becoming a grim reflection of his deteriorating mental state. But the real horror lay beneath the surface. Gein became obsessed with death, anatomy, and the female form. He spent hours poring over medical textbooks, anatomy manuals, and books on Nazi atrocities. His morbid fascination turned to action when he began robbing graves, digging up recently buried women whose appearances reminded him of his mother. Using the bodies, Gein engaged in gruesome acts of body modification. He would fashion items like lampshades, belts, and even a skin suit from human flesh, reportedly in an attempt to become his mother, a grotesque homage to the woman who had dominated his life. While Gein's grave-robbing activities were shocking, his crimes escalated to murder. On November 16, 1957, Bernice Worden, a local hardware store owner, disappeared. Her son, Frank, who was also the town deputy sheriff, found the store in disarray with a trail of blood leading out the door. Frank immediately suspected Gein, as he had been seen in the store earlier that day. When authorities searched Gein's farmhouse, they made a discovery so horrifying it shocked even the most hardened investigators. The farmhouse was a veritable chamber of horrors. Investigators found Worden's decapitated body hanging upside down in a barn, dressed like a deer carcass. Her torso had been gutted, and her head was later discovered in a burlap sack. Inside the home, authorities uncovered a nightmarish collection of human remains. Bowls made from human skulls, lampshades and chair covers crafted from human skin, a belt made of nipples, a corset and leggings stitched from the flesh of corpses. The most chilling item was the skin suit Gein had crafted, complete with a mask made from a woman's face. It became evident that Gein's grotesque hobby was not limited to grave robbing. He had murdered at least two women, Worden and Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had gone missing 3 years earlier. Gein was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, though he was eventually deemed unfit to stand trial due to his mental state. In 1968, he was found guilty but legally insane and was committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Gein spent the rest of his life in mental institutions, where he was described as a model patient. He died of respiratory failure on July 26, 1984 at the age of 77. Ed Gein's crimes have left an indelible mark on popular culture. His grotesque actions served as inspiration for Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. Samuel Little, often referred to as the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history, led a life shrouded in mystery, terror, and unimaginable violence. His chilling story, spanning over 6 decades, defies comprehension and remains a terrifying reminder of how a man, seemingly invisible to society, could commit such horrific acts of brutality while evading justice for decades. By the time his reign of terror ended, Little had confessed to 93 murders, many of which had gone unnoticed by law enforcement. This is the detailed account of Samuel Little's life, crimes, and the investigations that finally brought him to justice. Samuel McDowell Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, to a young unmarried woman named Kathleen Little. His father was largely absent, and his mother, who was reported to have been involved in a variety of criminal activities, was not able to care for him. Shortly after his birth, his mother moved to Lorain, Ohio, where Little grew up. His childhood was marked by neglect, instability, and poverty. Little was raised primarily by his mother, and though his exact upbringing remains murky, it was clear that it left a lasting impact on him. By all accounts, Samuel Little was a troubled child. He struggled with basic school subjects, and there were early signs of his violent tendencies. Throughout his youth, he was known to have exhibited a deep-seated rage, and this anger would later become a central part of his criminal personality. Little had a criminal record beginning in his teens, with petty crimes such as theft, but it wasn't until his adulthood that his violent behavior truly began to take shape. As a young man, Little joined the military, briefly serving in the U.S. Army, though his service was marred by several incidents of violence and trouble with authority. After his discharge, he found himself moving from city to city, struggling to maintain any steady employment. He became a drifter, often living on the margins of society. It was during these years that Little's violent tendencies began to escalate. In the 1960s, Samuel Little's crimes began to take on a more sinister and calculated nature. His criminal history started to evolve from petty theft to violent assaults, and eventually, to murder. His first known victim, a woman named Mary Ann, was killed in 1969 in Miami. Though her body was never found, Little later admitted to strangling her. It wasn't until years later, after Little's confession, that authorities were able to link him to this early crime. However, Little's true reign of terror began in the late 1970s and early 1980s. During this time, he began targeting vulnerable women, often sex workers or women with troubled backgrounds, who were easier to lure into his grasp. His method was chillingly methodical. He would typically approach women in public areas, bars, streets, or even social gatherings, offering them money, drugs, or transportation. Once he had them isolated, Little would strike. His modus operandi was simple yet effective. He would overpower his victims, strangle them to death, and often dispose of their bodies in remote areas. His victims were typically women of color, which made it easier for him to go undetected in many cases, as these murders were often not investigated thoroughly. He was careful to leave few physical traces behind, and his victims' deaths were often ruled as accidental overdoses, or deaths caused by unknown causes. For decades, Samuel Little's murders went largely unnoticed, or were misclassified as overdoses, natural deaths, or even suicides. His ability to evade capture was in part due to the fact that he targeted women who were frequently ignored by society. Many of his victims had criminal records, were involved in sex work, or were transient. Little's ability to charm and manipulate those around him also played a crucial role in his ability to escape suspicion for so long. Despite his increasingly violent actions, Samuel Little's criminal life remained somewhat obscure. Throughout the years, he was arrested multiple times for lesser crimes such as assault, fraud, and even rape. But he was never seriously connected to any of the murders he had committed. He was arrested numerous times for various violent offenses, but each time, he managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system. One of the most significant events in his criminal career occurred in 1984. Little was arrested for the brutal assault and rape of a woman in Florida. While in custody, he was linked to the death of a woman named Audrey Nelson, who had been found strangled in a nearby neighborhood. Despite the clear evidence of his involvement, the case against Little was never strong enough to convict him at the time. He was released on bond. The following year, Little was arrested again, this time for the murder of 3 women in Los Angeles. However, in another stroke of luck, he managed to beat the charges due to a lack of solid evidence linking him to the deaths. He was eventually released, and his killing spree continued, albeit more discreetly. For decades, Samuel Little slipped in and out of the criminal justice system, each time narrowly avoiding capture. His ability to manipulate authorities, charm those around him, and escape serious scrutiny meant that he continued to prey on vulnerable women without consequence. It wasn't until the late 2010s that his past would catch up with him. In 2012, Samuel Little was arrested in Kentucky after a routine check on a man who was wanted for a minor crime. It was only then that authorities began to take a more serious look at his criminal history. In 2014, a breakthrough came when DNA evidence linked Little to the murder of a woman named Linda May May, a victim of his in 1984. This discovery prompted law enforcement to reopen multiple cold cases linked to Little's crimes, and investigators began connecting the dots between his string of unsolved murders. By the time of his arrest, Little was already a known figure in the criminal world, but his crimes had remained largely undiscovered. In 2018, during an interview while serving his time in prison, Samuel Little began to confess to the murders he had committed over the decades. He would later admit to strangling 93 women, each of which had been carefully chosen based on their vulnerability. His confessions were chilling, as he recalled in vivid detail the faces of his victims, where he had dumped their bodies, and the specific manner in which he had killed them. Little's ability to remember his victims in such detail was one of the most disturbing aspects of his confessions. Little's confessions, backed by DNA evidence and extensive investigation, led to the discovery of many previously unknown victims. Investigators were able to link him to a string of unsolved murders across the country, spanning from the 1970s through the 2000s. His killing spree occurred across multiple states, including California, Texas, and Florida. He had often changed his appearance and used multiple aliases to evade detection, making it even harder to connect him to the crimes. Little's murders, though seemingly random in their nature, followed a clear and horrifying pattern. He targeted women who were often vulnerable, marginalized, or involved in illegal activities. He preyed on their loneliness and desperation, luring them into his control before committing his gruesome acts. After strangling his victims, Little would often leave their bodies in remote, desolate areas, which helped avoid immediate detection. Samuel Little's death toll and his ability to evade capture for so many years raise uncomfortable questions about the justice system's treatment of marginalized individuals, particularly women of color. His crimes remained undetected for so long, in part because of the lack of attention paid to these victims, who were often overlooked by law enforcement. Little's confessions have led to numerous cold cases being reopened, with many of his victims finally receiving the justice that had been denied to them for decades. Samuel Little passed away on December 30th, 2020 at the age of 80, while serving life in prison. The legacy he left behind is one of devastation and horror, as his true body count likely remains unknown. Despite his death, the investigation into his crimes continues, with authorities working to identify more of his victims and bring closure to their families. In the end, Samuel Little's story is a grim reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows, and the darkness that can reside within a seemingly ordinary individual. His brutal reign of terror, spanning decades, was a horrifying chapter in American crime history, and the full extent of his horrors may never be known. Samuel Little's story is one of horrifying brutality, spanning over 4 decades. Known as the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history, Little confessed to murdering 93 women, with investigators confirming at least 60 of these deaths. His crimes reveal not only his monstrous nature, but also glaring systemic failures in recognizing and addressing the deaths of society's most vulnerable. This is the detailed story of Samuel Little's life, crimes, and the investigations that brought his reign of terror to light. Born on June 7, 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia, Samuel McDowell Little came into the world under the shadow of hardship. His mother, reportedly a sex worker, gave birth while incarcerated. Shortly after, Little was moved to Lorain, Ohio, where he was raised primarily by his grandmother. His childhood was steeped in neglect and poverty, an upbringing that planted the seeds for his future deviance. Little struggled academically and emotionally, dropping out of high school before finishing 9th grade. He displayed an early inclination toward violence, particularly against women, and developed a fascination with physical domination. His fixation on strangulation began in adolescence, an eerie foreshadowing of the crimes he would later commit. By the time he reached adulthood, he was already building a criminal record for petty thefts, assaults, and burglaries. In his early 20s, Little became a drifter, moving from state to state with no fixed address or steady employment. His nomadic lifestyle allowed him to stay under the radar while committing increasingly violent acts. He took odd jobs, often as a laborer or cemetery worker, and supplemented his income with theft. His criminal record expanded rapidly. Between the late 1950s and 1970s, Little was arrested dozens of times for theft, assault, fraud, shoplifting, and DUI. Despite his frequent run-ins with law enforcement, he faced only short stints in jail, escaping serious consequences due to the system's inability to link him to more serious crimes. This revolving door of arrests and releases set the stage for his unchecked killing spree. Samuel Little claimed his first victim in 1970, though some investigators believe he may have started killing earlier. His modus operandi was chillingly consistent. He targeted vulnerable women, often sex workers, drug users, or those experiencing homelessness. individuals less likely to be reported missing or thoroughly investigated by law enforcement. Little used his charm to lure women into his car, offering rides, drugs, or companionship. Once alone with them, he would strike, overpowering his victims with his immense strength. His weapon of choice was his hands. He strangled his victims to death, taking pleasure in the act. Strangulation allowed him to exert complete control, satisfying his deep-seated need for domination. He often left his victims' bodies in remote areas, where they could go undiscovered for weeks, months, or even years. Little's selection of marginalized victims helped him evade detection. Many of his killings were initially classified as overdoses, accidents, or deaths by undetermined causes, leaving families without closure and authorities without leads. This indifference from the system emboldened him, allowing his spree to continue unchecked for decades. Although Little was arrested multiple times throughout the 1980s and 1990s, he managed to avoid long-term incarceration for murder. In 1982, he was arrested in Pascagoula, Mississippi, for the murder of 22-year-old Melinda Rose Lepre, whose body was found in a cemetery. Witnesses identified Little as the last person seen with Lepre, but a grand jury declined to indict him due to insufficient evidence. Later that year, Little was arrested in Florida for the assault and attempted murder of 2 women. He was acquitted of both charges. Despite these close calls, his violent tendencies persisted, and he continued to kill with impunity. In 1984, Little was arrested in San Diego, California, for attacking 2 women. One victim escaped and reported the assault, leading to his conviction for assault and false imprisonment. He served only 2 years in prison before being released in 1987. After his release, he resumed killing almost immediately, targeting women across the country as he traveled from state to state. Little's ability to evade justice began to unravel in 2012. By then, he was living in a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, and surviving on meager disability checks. He was arrested on a narcotics charge and extradited to California, where DNA evidence linked him to 3 cold cases in Los Angeles. The victims, Carol Elford, 1987, Guadalupe Apodaca, 1987, and Audrey Nelson, 1989, had all been strangled. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Little was convicted in 2014 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This marked the end of his killing spree, but the full scope of his crimes was far from uncovered. In 2018, Texas Ranger James Holland began interviewing Little in prison. Over the course of hundreds of hours, Little confessed to 93 murders committed between 1970 and 2005. He provided detailed descriptions of his victims, often recalling their faces and circumstances with chilling precision. He even drew sketches of many victims, which were later used to identify some of the women. Little's confessions were verified through DNA evidence, witness testimonies, and crime scene analysis, confirming his involvement in at least 60 murders. His victims were scattered across 19 states, with many cases still under investigation. The confessions revealed Little's extraordinary memory and his twisted pride in recounting his crimes. Little's killing spree exposed deep flaws in the justice system. He exploited systemic biases, targeting women of color, sex workers, and those living on society's margins. These victims were often dismissed by authorities, their deaths receiving little to no attention. The lack of communication between jurisdictions further allowed Little to evade detection, as law enforcement agencies failed to connect his crimes across state lines. Samuel Little died on December 30, 2020, at the age of 80, while serving his sentence at a California prison. Despite his death, investigations into his crimes continue, as authorities work to identify the remaining victims and provide closure to their families.